Good evening, Assalamu alaikum, welcome. I hope all is well and everybody is staying safe and healthy in these times. I wanted to come today really to speak about the new report that was released by Amnesty International, Israel's apartheid against the Palestinians, a cruel system of domination and crime against humanity. Uh, I felt that this is an important moment for us to really think about the development both inside Palestine, but more importantly, the international community at this time. One would raise the question of what is the importance of all these reports, international law, the International Criminal Court, United Nations report. Uh, One can be, at least taken back because the situation in Palestine continued to deteriorate. We see the type of oppression that the Palestinians are facing. So I don't blame you for at least saying, okay, so what will be the consequences? What might happen? This is another report. Let me say that our struggle is a cumulative long-term struggle. We've been at it for almost 100 plus years. If we take the beginning of the Balfour Declaration, the arrival of the British and the occupation of Palestine in 1917, passing through the 1929 protest mobilization, the 1936 general strike and revolt, to passing through the Nakba, the 56 period, and so on. So we've been at it for a long time, but it seems that as a result of cumulative work, cumulative engagement of people from near and far, that there is definitely a qualitative and quantitative change that is being witnessed. Amnesty International report comes on the heels of a number of other reports. We have the reports from Human Rights Watch that was very, very important in fixing and determining that Israel is engaging in apartheid against the Palestinians. We had the B'Tselem also using the term apartheid. The United Nations, in a number of resolutions and references, likewise using apartheid. And now we're also expecting that the United Nations Human Rights Committee is going to issue a report that will also affix and use the term apartheid. So, meaning that Israel have completely lost the debate within the international human rights community and atmosphere in such a way that the defense of Israel has to take account that now it is an apartheid state. Now, the distance from having this determination until an actual reflective in change in policy will take some time. And that's where many of us and all of us have to be active in translating this accumulative work of human rights organizations into a change in policy, first and foremost at the local level, at universities, at schools, at your libraries, at every area of engagement where you are engaged. Now it's the time for us to actually make an impact. Now, if you think about the conclusion of Amnesty International in their report, and again, this is a cumulative, it says the totality of the regime of laws, policies, and practices described by Amnesty International demonstrates that Israel has established and maintained an institutionalized regime of oppression and domination of the Palestinian population for the benefit of Jewish Israelis. a system of apartheid. So that's a very important conclusion and determination of Amnesty International. But what is also significant in this is that whenever it has exercised control over Palestinian lives since 1948, so many of those who are speaking or speak about Palestine try to use it in 1967 area, in the West Bank and the Area A. Actually, Amnesty in here is doing something very important and critical by pointing that whenever Israel has exercised control over Palestinian lives since 1948, Amnesty International concludes that the state of Israel considers and treats Palestinians as inferior non-Jewish racial group. For anyone who studies race, racism, and so on, at the core of racism is distinguishing people, different body or different bodied people, and treating them differently in relations to this racial identification. And the process of also racialization, where a group that might not be classified within a racial landscape, it could be determined to be of this racial categorization. And again, for individuals who possibly have read the work of Michael O'May on racial formation and so on, so there's the literature in there is very extensive. So in here, Amnesty International conclusion it really is very important. It says Amnesty International concludes that the state of Israel considers and treats Palestinians as an inferior non-Jewish racial group. The segregation is conducted in a systematic and highly institutionalized manner through laws, policies, and practices, all of which are intended to prevent the Palestinians from claiming and enjoying equal rights to Jewish Israelis within the territory of Israel and within the occupied territories, and thus are intended to oppress and dominate the Palestinian people. Right? So again, it is making a very important finding and statements in relation to their conclusion that the policies, the laws, policies, and practices that are set in place are systematic, highly institutionalized, and this is very important, systematic and institutionalized, because there is often the defense, which we saw it just in the past few days, that these are few Israeli soldiers that are acting outside of the command, that the bad apple defense, which often organizations, states, and companies will actually always resort to, saying these bad apples are the ones that did, and they find a way to identify a number of individuals while protecting the system, the structure. So what Amnesty is pointing out, correctly so, Palestinians have been saying it all along, not only in 48, but even before 48, that this is a systematic and is part of an institutionalized system that, in essence, enshrined in laws and policies and practices that are rooted in casting the Palestinians as an inferior racial group. Right? Now, I know that some of the Zionist distractors that will come and say, well, the Jews were oppressed, they face anti-Semitism. Oh, for sure, that is a valid, correct. We could trace it back into history. But the fact that one racial group has been oppressed and continue to be oppressed in one setting or the other relative to facing anti-Semitism does not preclude them from actually constituting Israel itself on the basis of apartheid and embracing a racial inferior structure that is imposed to dominate the Palestinians. I am saying this because I already saw the responses from the Zionist establishment here in the United States, those who are constantly will come out and defend Israel right or wrongs, rather than actually coming out and saying, yes, we are identifying and we're seeing that this is a system of apartheid and oppression. They immediately use the card of attacking the messenger and basically saying that this will actually cause increased anti-Semitism. So this is the defensive mechanism that we're seeing it. So they have not answered to any of the findings, the systematic, the research and the findings that Amnesty actually have put forth. So again, Amnesty's conclusion is very important. In addition, that Amnesty also does offer us a recommendation. Their report is very, very extensive. You could spend some time in reading it, as well as building on the Human Rights Watch. But actually, in recommendation, they said that dismantling this cruel system of apartheid is essential for the millions of Palestinians who continue to live in Israel and in the occupied territories, as well as for the return of Palestinian refugees who remain displaced in neighboring countries, often within 100 kilometers of their original home. So this is another element that I would say is very significant relative to Amnesty International. We're not in here reporting out that Amnesty International, again, as one of the human rights organizations that for quite some time, those issues were at least not as clear in how Amnesty dealt with Palestine. But this is actually positive development in recognizing that Palestinians are facing an apartheid and a structure, both in Israel itself as well as in the 1948 area, but more importantly, actually calling for the right of return. And we know, for those who have been observing the Oslo framework, that continue to try to bypass and try to find ways where the right of return is not to be implemented, is to be limited to only certain individuals, and especially became clear during the Trump's initiative under the Abraham Accord. One part of it is to liquidate the totality of the Palestinians' right of return. So this is very important in relations to Amnesty International recommendation that dismantling this cruel system of apartheid is essential for the millions of Palestinians who continue to live in Israel, in the occupied territories, as well as for the return of Palestinian refugees who remain displaced in neighboring countries, often within 100 kilometers of their original home, so that they can enjoy their human rights free from discrimination. So again, this is very important, that the focus on Palestinian human rights, that the equality of the Palestinian rights, the right for them to live in dignity, the right for them not to be living in fear, the fact that Palestinians should not have to constantly be threatened with the demolition of their homes. In some cases where the Israelis force families in the West Bank to demolish their own homes with their own hands, and if they don't, and Israelis end up then, not only that you lose your home, but you actually are fined and pay for the amount of money that the occupation forces, the military forces, which is working cooperatively, collaboratively with the settlers currently in the occupied territories. If you think about Sheikh Jarrah, or you think about the communities in Naqab, and so on. So in here it's saying that the Palestinians can enjoy their human rights free from discrimination. So the focus is on Palestinian human rights, Palestinian facing discrimination. Now, I know that discourse in the US, especially among the congressional leadership, with few exceptions, that the language is always focusing on Israel's security, which is the right of Israel to practice apartheid over the Palestinian population. That's the language that we need to actually challenge the politicians whenever they pony up with this, that Israel has the right to defend itself and have the right to security. Apartheid systems do not have the right to actually oppress the population that they are exercising apartheid toward, meaning that these notions of an open-ended hand for Israel to exercise wanton violence against the Palestinians is in itself an act of empowering and extending of apartheid, which is something that I'll actually say later on. Amnesty International mentions the culpability of the international community in this sense. So Amnesty International is calling on Israel to remove all measures of discrimination, segregation, and oppression currently in place against the Palestinian population, and to undertake a review of all laws, regulations, policies, and practices that discriminate on racial, ethnic, or religious grounds, with a view of to repealing or amending them in line with international human rights law and standards. Now, again, challenging Israel to change all these regulations is still is one step. And I do think that for us who are engaged in the Palestinian struggle, self-determination, sovereignty, the right to land, all these issues are not addressed in relations to Amnesty International overall, but one has to give credit and provide a context to the language that are being used, which is also points to a change that is occurring within the landscape of the human rights organization. Amnesty also calls for Israel must grant equal and full human rights to all Palestinians in Israel and the occupied territories in line with principles of international human rights law and without discrimination, while ensuring respect for the protection guaranteed for Palestinians in the occupied territories under international humanitarian law. Right? So again, that Israel must grant equal and full human rights to all Palestinians in Israel and the occupied territories in line with international law, international human rights. Now, Israel for so long has been using its own so-called constructed security, military necessity, all types of excuses to continue to violate Palestinian rights. And also the fact that the United States have been an enabling agent for Israel by giving it protection in international setting, by providing it the weapons to continue to undertake all types of violence against the Palestinians, and shielding it from any critique in various settings. So again, continue with Amnesty. It must also recognize the right of Palestinian refugees and their descendants to return to homes where they or their families once lived in Israel or in the occupied territories. So this is again is the whole debate that occurred during the Trump administration that wanted to limit the refugees' right of return only to those actual refugees that were expelled in 1948, but not their descendants, which will reduce, if you actually take the numbers, to a minuscule number of Palestinians having the right of return. Let's be very clear. Now we have close to 6 million Palestinian refugees. These are refugees that live in refugee camps inside the occupied territories in the West Bank, refugees who live in Gaza, refugees who live in the camps in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria. The overwhelming number of Palestinian refugees are still within 100 kilometers, and their descendants are still there. I know that in some Zionist corners, they immediately want to say, well, it's the responsibility of the Arab countries that they should be the ones to take these refugees to settle them. And look at us. We had a number of Jewish immigrants and refugees that came, including from some Arab countries, and we actually settled them. In here, there's a double erasure that is taking place. If you ask the Jewish communities, or what you call the Eastern Jewish community, because there's the immigrants and the refugees that came from Iraq, that came from Yemen. They face a high level of discrimination and racism inside Israel. There is the case that is going through the Israeli courts of Yemeni children were taken from their family. Jewish Yemeni kids were taken from their families and were given to Western Jewish families. So in order for them to be brought up away from their Eastern, in essence, Eastern frame of reference. In the same way, if you think about the indigenous native population, whether in Canada or the United States, many of the kids who were taken into these boarding schools away from their families, not allowed to speak their language. So in a similar Orientalist constructed paradigm, Israel, on the one hand, celebrate this immigration of Eastern Jews into Israel, while simultaneously had a structure of racial discrimination because Israel conceives itself and views itself, especially relative to Zionists, as an outpost of Western civilization. So embedded in Zionism and Israel, this notion of racial superiority that were actually put into practice against Eastern Jews, the Mizrahi Jews, whether it's Yemenis, Moroccans, Iraqis. And we also saw it in the later point when the Ethiopian Jews were brought into Israel. They faced also similar discrimination, so much so that their donations of blood was actually thrown out because they were seen to be inferior and more susceptible to all kinds of distorted notions of the Ethiopian Jewish population being predominantly Black, and therefore anti-Blackness also was a discourse that was seen practiced in Israel. On the other hand, making this comparison also, Israel can claim to be a victim of the Arab countries that have caused the migration of Jewish population in Israel. Not that Israel wanted the Jewish populations to be migrating to Israel, because that allows it to have the demographic capacity, because it's any apartheid structure and any racial structure always focuses on the question of demographics. The Moroccan Jews are also a very interesting group in the sense, almost 700, some say as high as 1 million Moroccan Jews migrated into Israel and facilitated through Israel's relationship with King Hassan II, whom the Israeli Mossad worked with him to try to provide him political protection and cover against his opposition. And this quid pro quo type of relationship allowed an operation that brought Moroccan Jews into Israel in large hundreds of thousands during that period. And now we see the normalization that is occurring between Israel and Morocco. That normalization under the table occurred as early the 1960s and continued unabated under various periods within Morocco. So again, this idea, this discussion about the Palestinian refugees is at the core is a question of racial demographic thinking on behalf of Israel and all its supporters. Meaning you could reduce it that they don't want to see too many Arabs in the neighborhood. This also applies to Palestinian, Arab, Christian, and Muslims, but I would argue that also deep down within Israel Zionist worldview is also too many Mizrahis expressing their Arabness and affinity to the Arab world is also problematic because it shapes and reconfigures the way that Israel views itself and posits itself as a Western project, bringing modernity, bringing progress, development from a Eurocentric worldview. So Zionism actually is a Eurocentric project that it sees itself as part of the continuity, even though when actually one examines the history of Europe and its relations to the Jewish subject, one has to scratch his head, because I do scratch my head every so often, is that Europe have committed time and time again a systematic oppression of the Jewish population, constant pogroms, constant anti-Semitism. And you go back in history from the Crusades period to the Inquisition, which also affected Muslims and Jews, to his expulsion of Spain. So in which way can you actually think of Zionism casting itself as part of the Eurocentric extension unless or until they actually embodied or internalized the epistemic of their European oppressor and took it to shape their relationship with the Palestinians on the one hand, but also with Mizrahi Jews in this sense. And I think I recommend the work of our dear Professor Ella Shohat on the question of the Mizrahi Jews, because that's again a question that is very, very important. Ella Shohat have wrote about it. She was in NYU, and that relationship in there. So the discussions about the right of return gets into the core of this question and this aspect. More further, Amnesty International actually says Israel must provide victims of human rights violations, crimes against humanity, and serious violation of international human rights, international humanitarian law, and their families with full reparations. These should include restitution of and compensation for all properties acquired on a racial basis. Okay, this is a very, very important standard. This should include restitution of and compensation for all properties acquired on a racial basis. Israel have benefited from acts of genocide. The Palestinians in 1948 in the Nakba faced the system or a campaign of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and Israel benefited from acts of ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Palestinians, expelling upward of 750,000 Palestinians, depopulating, ethnically cleansing 8 urban centers, emptying 532 villages, and committing systematic massacres against Palestinians. We have so far, in terms of documentation, over 120 massacres that were documented and written about from the 1947-48 Nakba. And the recent article in Haaretz about Tonetra's massacre being on the mass grave on the beach, I reminded people that the massacre has been documented by the Palestinian victims from the time it occurred. So we have writings in Palestinian Encyclopedia. We have the writings on these massacres, writing from Walid al-Khalidi, Ibrahim Abu Lughod, the historians from that period. So the fact that now we have some corroborating evidence from the perpetrator side, meaning from the Israel archive, that's positive, but we should not actually delude ourselves that we did not know about it. Every time you have a massacre that took place, usually the victims have actually reported and recorded what happened to their families and their relative, their village, and so on, whether it's Deir Yassin or any of the other 120 massacres in Palestine. So what is occurring is what we need is right now, the Israeli archives are corroborating the victims' narrative that spoke of these massacres. So just to contextualize what developed and what transpired. So again, continuing with the recommendation piece of Amnesty, it says the scale and seriousness of the violations documented in this report that they published make it clear that the international community, so now taking the international community to task, which is something that we need to take. Again, even the notion of the international community is so problematic, because when when the term international community means, it refers to the United States and Europe. And I'm sorry, United States and Europe are less than 1/20th of the world population. So when we talk about the international community, it's basically a very small number of countries that they themselves were the primary violators of international law. Again, the United States invading Iraq under bogus terms, continued its oppression in relations to the drone warfare, open season, the torture regimes, whether and with the rendition, and also if you think about Britain, France just have sent troops to Mali and is still engaged in the Francophone. But be it as it may be, this is a different topic that I don't want to go on to a tangent to it. But in here, Amnesty International says that the international community needs to urgently and drastically change its approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And again, I have an issue with calling the conflict is a regime of apartheid, but let that go right now, and recognize the full extent of the crimes that Israel perpetrates against the Palestinian people. Indeed, for over 7 decades, the international community has stood by as Israel has been given free rein to dispossess, segregate, control, oppress, and dominate Palestinians. So again, for many of these international community actors, again, they come to Palestine, let's have a dialogue, we need to get the both parties together, and then in the diaspora, all the type of interfaith that is taking place, just we can have a dialogue and get them both to talk. All this is really continue to pass the responsibility and empowers the continued violation that Israel undertakes. So this structure, this system has to be jettisoned, and anyone that wants to speak in relations to Palestine has to begin with apartheid. Apartheid as it's practiced, violation of international law that is practiced daily. So let's not say, oh, let's have a dialogue. This is not a difference of opinion about what to order for dinner. This is not a difference of opinion of I see this way, I see it. This is a structure of a systematic structure of apartheid that is intended to segregate the Palestinians, to control their life in all ways, structure of oppression and domination of the Palestinians. The numerous UN security resolutions adopted over the years have remained unimplemented, with Israel facing no repercussions whatsoever for actions that it have violated international law, apart from these formulaic statements every once in a while we hear. So again, we need to take any of these international community at the local level. So you get the mayor's office, the city council, let's have what you call partnership for peace, partnership for this, dialogue. All this is actually extends the suffering of the Palestinians because it's intended to center Israel's interests at the expense of Palestinians at challenging apartheid as it goes. And we're seeing it today. If you are following, demolition of homes, the sending people out in the street, forcing them to demolish their own homes, arrest of individuals. Today, they just went to, Shafat and forced a family to knock the walls in their own house, right? This is a level of depravity relative to the violation of the basic dignity of a human being that is beyond pale. Again, I know that every, Zionist that is listening or acting is, the Palestinians are violent. Again, so this is what I call the constant attempt to rationalize a structural systematic, whether Palestinians are violent or not. Violence is imposed because apartheid is the highest form of violence that's practiced on a daily basis. The occupation of all of Palestine is a structural systematic violence that is continuously taking place every day. Palestinians live violence, breathe violence of Israeli structures on them every day. And therefore, the tangential argument is used as a way to continue the dispossession, the segregation, the taking over of land, the empowering of settlements and settlements, the ability, the enforceability of trying to actually bring about active way to limit and curtail Palestinian lives. So again, this is very important for us to take the international community, civil society, also the individuals at institutions, universities, and so on, to take them to task. When will you actually wake up? Not physically, but when will you actually begin to wake up and to say that Palestinians have the right for human rights and have the right to life, have the right to have justice, have the right to their homes, have the right to be where they are? When will that take place? And when will you stop trying to actually become a desk in Israel's foreign policy apparatus? When will you stop actually being an instrument of the what used to be the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, but now is shifted into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs? When will you actually stop doing this? When will you stop coordinating with the Israeli consulates in your region? When will you stop coordinating with the educational office that comes to me to coordinate and facilitate how actually our own students in universities actually are able to speak or address the issues of Palestine? So we need to be very clear now. This is a moment of clarity of how for engagement on the questions of Palestine will actually take place, and how we take the cumulative determination of the human rights community. Again, Amnesty is one, Human Rights Watch, Beit Salim, and I'm not speaking about Palestinian human rights organizations. That's a foregone conclusion. The report Adala and so on have done their work, and they've been engaging systematically in critiquing and providing the evidence. But now the international community, human rights organizations and human rights community now is coming clear. I'm still waiting. Let me just be very clear. I'm still waiting for the Sierra Club. I'm still waiting for the environmental community to actually come to speak. I want them to come and speak about the cutting of trees. Where are you? Isn't it only trees in Berkeley or trees in some places, but there is complete silence on the cutting and severing and complete using the cutting of trees as a form of collective punishment? Where is the report from Sierra Club? Where is the report from the environmental communities? Where are the report about the water and the stealing of water, of the Palestinian water? Where is the reports about the stealing of water and the continued overuse, or completely shifting the landscape in Palestine, so much so that the Dead Sea is actually going to be literally dead with no water left to it, because much of the water is being taken by all these types of settlements and settlers that want to live a lifestyle that in California is no longer amenable. New York is no longer amenable for the low level of water and the different environmental crises that we have. So the human rights community have spoken. I'm really waiting. I'm interested to see the report to come from these main institutions that address the environment, whether it's the Green Deal. Again, we are calling for the Green Deal in here as far as changing our policy and priorities, but I still I'm waiting for a similar report that would address it. Most often, actually, which is interesting, some of the environmental movement brings and how Israel has been what you call the creative state in managing water resources, greenery, and so on. So you could, on the one hand, have drip irrigation while actually dripping injustice simultaneously, because drip irrigation that is being implemented is implemented on land that is stolen. The greenery and the forest is actually trying to cover up some of the villages that completely were emptied of its own population. Some of the drip irrigation is stealing water from the Palestinian aquifers in the West Bank. Right? So all of this is very, very important for us to actually begin to challenge the environmental movement, the environmental organization here in the United States and Europe, to actually maybe to come down from the trees and actually look down and see what is taking place. I am all for being on the trees, hungry the trees. I am as engaged and interested in subject, but it seems that Palestine is almost a complete zone of untouchableness for the environmental movement. So again, in here, Amnesty is taking the international community to task by saying that you have not acted. It says addressing Israeli violations against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip merely within the framework of international humanitarian law and separately from violations perpetrated against Palestinians in Israel has failed to tackle the root causes of the conflict and achieve any form of accountability and justice for the victims. So we need to actually make sure that we take to task the international community, civil society, and areas and communities that should be taken a different track. So another element of their recommendation says, without taking any meaningful actions to hold Israel to account for its systematic and widespread violations and crimes under international law against the Palestinian population. This is, I think, is very important phrase. The international community has contributed to undermining the international legal order and has emboldened Israel to continue perpetrating crimes with impunity. I think this sentence is such a powerful sentence from Amnesty, and I give credit to the authors who worked in this. It says the international community has contributed to undermining the international legal order and has emboldened Israel to continue perpetrating crimes with impunity. So this is very important, meaning putting the onus on the international community because they've been often agents of emboldening and allowing, and I'm not also speaking about selling weapons and providing weapons, especially the United States, three plus billions a year, and also the European countries that continue to facilitate the selling of arms, cooperation in the security apparatus. If you think about the Pegasus surveillance system, all that, while taking account of it, in here, international community is actually emboldened Israel. In fact, some states have actively supported Israel's violation by supplying it with arms, equipment, and other tools to perpetrate crimes under international law, and by providing diplomatic cover, including the United Nations Security Council, to shield it from accountability. By doing so, they have completely failed the Palestinian people. They have completely failed the Palestinian. International community have failed the Palestinian community. I'm still waiting for Great Britain failed the Palestinian community. They need to apologize to the Palestinian community. They need to pay restitution for the Palestinian community. They need to withdraw and negate the Balfour Declaration. They need to beg forgiveness from the Palestinian people rather than continue to target Palestinians, continue to target anyone that speaks about the Palestinians, continue to demonize anyone that organizes for Palestinians in the UK. They target professors that speak on Palestine in the UK. You could see what they did to Jeremy Corbyn in the UK because of his identification and speaking on Palestinians. So the international community in the UK in particular, because they have been at the forefront. They issued the Balfour Declaration from deep anti-Semitic feelings. If you think Lord Balfour himself, and he's no lord to anyone, but that's his name, Arthur Balfour. He himself was deeply anti-Semitic. He felt about solving or addressing, transferring Jews out of Great Britain at the time, while simultaneously trying to protect the Suez Canal and the British trade, especially the one that's coming from India, because India is the treasure of the crown. Treasure of the Great Britain, and then Egypt was also a colony. So in this sense, their idea of creating a buffer state where they strike two birds with one stone, on the one hand, they actually send Jews out of Europe from a deeply anti-Semitic worldview, and on the other, they have protection from their point of view to the Suez Canal. So the international community is actually has to be held responsible. So again, some states have actively supported Israel's violation. by supporting it with arms. The United States supports Israel with arms. France supports Israel with arms. UK supports Israel with arms. Right? And then I would like to add these so people don't feel that I am leaving people only speaking one side. I want to take the Arab world also to task. United Arab Emirates. We need to take United Arab Emirates to task at this point. Not only that they are embracing a total normalization, but they're cooperating in security, in surveillance at various levels. They also are moving toward investing. The last report, they're investing a considerable amount of money in the Israeli economy at the expense of the Palestinians and engagement with Palestinians. You could speak of Morocco, its normalizations with Israel. You could speak of Egypt, that they continued not only bending backward, but actually cooperating toward limiting Palestinians, and that has really have a devastating impact on the Palestinians. You could speak about Jordan, its normalization with Israel, is giving its own water to Israel while Israel pumps its sewage-treated water. So the Jordanian society, which has almost 60-65% Palestinians, are thirsty for water. They're giving their own right of water to Israel, while Israel actually directing its sewage-treated water to Jordan, and then opening the Jordanian economy totally for Israel's penetration and continued building of their economy. And these days, when Israeli President Herzog visited United Arab Emirates, he flew over Saudi Arabia. That's a form of what you call a de facto recognition, because countries that have a recognition will allow the use of their airspace for a state that they no longer consider an enemy. So for those who actually understand what is taking place, Saudi Arabia is giving a de facto recognition of Israel, normalizing relations, and they're seeing whether that normalization of relations will actually take place without it being noticed. So that's the reality that is occurring as we speak. And then you add also some other countries that have facilitated all types of direct and indirect diplomatic relations in the Arab world. And also you could speak of the Muslim world, whether it's Indonesia with its own trade relations and normalizations and so on. So the international community, both its Western dimension and its Arab and Muslim dimension, have failed the Palestinians. Now I know somebody will say, well, why should we why should we only focus on Palestine? Okay, I'm not telling you only to focus on Palestine. I will ask you to focus on Yemen. I will ask you to focus on Kashmir. I'll ask you to focus on the Rohingya. I'll ask you to focus on what is taking place in India, in Myanmar. And also I was active in taking concern and being attended to working with our brothers in Latin America. I was part of the Central American Solidarity Movement, worked on anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, immigrant rights here in the United States. But the context about Palestine in particular is the following. From the United States, is that we are actually giving direct aid, $3.5 billion annually to Israel. And if you add all the other incentives, it actually amounts to much more than the $3.5 billion cash that comes from the budget. Let me give you this. You could laugh, but let me give you this because, laughing sometimes helps us. Right? I, as an American citizen, can donate to the Israeli Defense Force, the Friends of the Israeli Defense Force. So I could donate to the Israeli military, and my donations will be tax deductible. You can. I'm not what you call joking. This is the reality. And therefore, the United States has a considerable part. The second is that all of the machinations that are taking place is intertwining in the Arab world relative to Israel and the United States. And therefore, as a Palestinian and those who work with us are focusing on this, what you call linkages and connections. Lastly, I would point out for the discussions in relations to apartheid, Palestinians were on the right side of history in relations to apartheid South Africa. When apartheid South Africa was in full operation, when Nelson Mandela was sent to jail in 1964, Palestinians stood in solidarity and actually actively were supporting the ANC and the anti-apartheid movement. They provided resources, they provided training. Not, and this is not boasting, but this is for us, was part of our obligation of actually supporting people that are facing oppression. And South Africa was the clear example at the time of an apartheid system. Palestinians opened their training camps in Lebanon, training camps in Algeria, also provided support in Mozambique, where some of the ANC military activists who were opposing the ANC were present. So this relationship also expressed itself in the mobilization for the South Africa PDS movement at the time, which is the boycott movement, which is right now we're having the PDS movement. So all this was building accumulatively the relationship on opposing apartheid in South Africa. Israel, on the other hand, supported the South Africa's regime, supported by sending it and violating the armed embargo that was imposed on South Africa. It was actually sending weapons to the white supremacist South African regime during apartheid. The security fence that was built between Mozambique and South Africa, it was an Israeli company that also was helping the South African apartheid regime in providing this fence and building the security. Furthermore, if we think about the United States, the ADL, the Defamation League, was also culpable by spying on South African activists and sharing that information with the South African regime. We have it from the ADL case that here sprung out in San Francisco in 1992, where the files showed that the ADL was sharing that information both with the British intelligence and also the South African apartheid regime. So Palestinians were on the right side of history when it came to opposing the apartheid regime in South Africa, while Israel again acted and supported and violated the international human rights body at the time by supporting and providing support for South Africa, militarily violating the armed embargo that was set up. So we need to be very sure to understand history, to understand the context of what is taking place at this particular time relative to taking the international community to task, and we should take him to task constantly in there. So I know that I took a lot of your time, but let me just conclude with talking a little bit about the concept of apartheid, so we conclude this with understanding, which I encourage everyone to read the report. It's very important. It's a very extensive, over 230 pages as a report. Very important to do so. The executive summary, again, beginning on page 11, you could, if you don't have much time, you could read that. But if you are able, and for those who are listening, do a printout of it, send it to your local congressman and congresswoman, share it with your mayor and city council members, because again, if we don't make this information known, and I'm talking about the Amnesty International report. This was released today. It is titled Israel's Apartheid Against Palestinians, a Cruel System of Domination and Crime Against Humanity. So make sure that you actually download, and see if I could put it on the chat section so people can possibly access it in that way. So you will have it. So make sure that you download it and you actually share it, because what we want is people to use the information and to share that information as widely as possible in order to have an impact. I'm trying to see where I'm able to locate it right now in a minute and see if I'm able to do so. Okay, here we go. So this is Amnesty International Report. I'm gonna post it on the screen for everybody. So this is the report that you could actually access. So please access it. It is available in many languages, but again, for us here in the United States, and also if you are in the UK or someplace, please print it out, share it with your Congress person, your representative, to the mayor's office. If you're at the university, share this with the president or chancellor of your university. Share it with faculty members or the academic senate. This information again is very important, very critical for us to make it widely known and accessible, and don't allow anyone to actually discuss this away, creating a way for to shift it into a dialogue discussion, to shift it into complexity. There's many who say, well, the Palestinians are so complex, we just can't really understand what's saying. Let me say, settler colonialism is not complex. There is nothing complex about hegemonic power. There is nothing complex about knowing and seeing the domination of one group of the other. Right? There is nothing complex about it. Those who want to argue complexity, they don't want to deal with the reality. If you want to understand Palestine, Israel, just think about the history of the indigenous population in the Americas. There's nothing mysterious. You don't need a Harry Potter wand in order for you to understand what is taking place. You don't need a mystery in order for us to sit down and just get smoke from the air in order to understand what's taking place. Hegemonic settler colonialism is very easy to understand. There's no mystery about it. Also, don't allow the discussion to go into what you call all these inconsequential discussion. This is apartheid, the domination, the segregation, the oppression of Palestinians by a state apparatus, systematic, using policies, laws, and institutions to do so. Nothing mysterious about it. You know, physics and astronomy is complex, right? Fuzzy math is complex. These are complex, but human institutions of domination and oppression is not complex. It's very easy. Those who want to put this complexity, they tell you you can't understand because you are limited in your mental rational capacity, and we are the ones that have all the answers, but they're the ones who are committing the oppressions or supporting oppression. So you need to know this is conveniently so. And lastly, I would say in relations to this process, don't allow them to silence you. I know for people who work with SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, those who organize Palestine, I know the type of oppression that is set on you on college campuses. I know that you are always put under extreme scrutiny. If you want to reserve a room for an event, it's just like you really need to go and get a United Nations resolution just to get a room for a lecture. They put on you security needs. You have to prove that you are not threatening the security of those who advocate for Israel, which is, again, a unique phenomena. And this is all intended to actually bring silence. Silencing the narrative of Palestinians, silencing their oppression, means that there is no change in policy. People will not actually examine what is taking place. Israel cannot actually explain itself. There's no way that you could explain apartheid. There is no way that you could explain house demolition. There is no way you could explain the cutting of trees. There is no way to explain collective punishment. There is no way to explain the fact that Palestinians from the West Bank can't marry another Palestinian from the 1948 area. There is no way to explain why a refugee that's living in a refugee camp does not have the right to go back to their home. They have the key to their home. They could see their home. In some places in Lebanon, they can actually see their own home. And Israel cannot explain this. The only way today is to actually practice silence, demonization, attempt to divert the discussions away. And many of them have become very skilled that every time you talk terrorism, Hamas, I think they're confusing Hamas with hummus, but again, we'll give them that. It's very difficult to pronounce. So that's the only what you call attempt, which is shifts the debate, because shifting the debate, again, is a process by which not actually allowing the speaking, the evidence to speak for itself. So again, you need to resist the tendency to silence you, the tendency to demonize you, the tendency to shift you into discussions that is not germane to the issue. Settler colonialism is what the Palestinians are experiencing, that is couched and structured with an apartheid system that leads to segregation of Palestinians, leads to their constant violations of their basic human rights, continued exercise of violence on them on a regular basis. So we need to understand that in order to really begin to address it. So what is apartheid? For us to conclude, apartheid is a violation of public international law. Apartheid is a violation of public international law, a grave violation of internationally protected human rights, and a crime against humanity under international criminal law. There are three main treaties, international treaties, that prohibit or explicitly criminalize apartheid. The International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racism, of Racial Discrimination, the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, which is called the Apartheid Convention, and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So all these three provide the basis for a consideration and understanding of apartheid. Article 2 of the Apartheid Convention is important, and the report actually goes in detail, very, very important for what they have provided. Article 2 of the Apartheid Convention says the term "the crime of apartheid, which shall include similar policies and practices of racial segregation and discriminations as practiced in Southern Africa, shall apply to the following inhumane acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them." So again, this is Article 2. And from these, it actually identifies a number of issues that we need to be aware of. And I'm just going to go through them, and then hopefully we'll conclude. It says, a denial to a member or member of a racial group or groups of the right to life and liberty of person. Okay, that's very important. This is the Convention on Apartheid. The denial to a member or a member of racial group of the right to life and liberty of person. Palestinians do not enjoy the right to life in the full understanding of what the right to life is about, and they do not enjoy the liberty of a person. That's just fundamental. Palestinians are living under a system of apartheid, whether it's in 1948 or in 1967. Your movement is restricted. Your ability to move from one place to the other. And again, Israel is constantly using the term security, 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 security. A system of apartheid is built upon demographic design. The security infrastructure is to bring about a demographic control of the racial group that is targeted. So it has nothing to do with security. Security is the excuse in order to silence anybody from outside and rationalize, again, the continued violations of Palestinian human rights and Palestinian right to life and liberty. Maybe I'll explain the following. Black communities in the United States are subject to the similar type of dynamics. The right to life and liberty of person is constantly under duress. And often those who use these, what you call violation of this, they immediately say, or black violence, the black neighborhoods. So they use the excuse, right? Because crime occurs in white neighborhoods, but you don't see a white person engaging in crime facing the same type of violence that is structured, again, because of it's a racial dimension, this makes it makes the policy directed at the Black community completely distinct and different. And this actually, the first article or the section A says, by murder of members of a racial group or group. Palestinians are being murdered, shot at on a daily basis by Israel and using the rubric of security. By the infliction upon the members of a racial group or groups of serious bodily or mental harm, by the infringement of their freedom or dignity, or by subjecting them to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment of punishment. Now, I want to stop in there on the second point. Every Palestinian in the West Bank, is constantly subject to this degradation of personhood. If you have watched the short movie, The Present, just on the structure of a person going through the checkpoint, the reality is Palestinians' daily life is completely degraded and subject to this degrading treatment by the institutions of Israel, especially Israel's military, which runs and governs the life of Palestinians. Every Palestinian is actually living a mental imprisonment in their own mind because their personhood is denied. Their history is denied. Their right to their land is denied. And you have a state that is engaging in a military domination, apartheid, that says you don't have the right to this land. Why? Because, again, they use instrumentalized biblical narrative that God promised us this, and as such, you in your own land, you don't have a right to this land. This is taking place today in Palestine. Palestinians do not have the safety and security in their own homes, which, again, if we think about the Convention of Apartheid, this is, again, item 2. The infliction upon the member of racial group, serious bodily. Okay, Palestinians are shot at unwantonly, right? Serious bodily, mental harm. Every Palestinian is facing a PTSD. Really, even Palestinian in the diaspora, when you sit there and watch every day, you watch the bombing of Gaza, you watch buildings collapsing, you watch people being shot at, you watch on TV the people that are going through Al-Aqsa Mosque to try to pray, and they're just completely being attacked, tear gas. In the most holiest day of the Muslim month of Ramadan, on the 27th, you're seeing people are being beaten, not for no other reason than actually wanting to actually go and pray in Al-Aqsa compound on the 27th of Ramadan. Can you imagine? Can you just for a moment imagine what would be the coverage if a group of Palestinians attacked any type of a religious gathering on the most holiest sites and doing similar practices? Again, if you have, just to compare for people, if the Christmas Mass in St. Peter's, and you'll see army and forces coming and tear gassing and so on, what would be the effect, not only for those inside Palestine, but also across? More so, it's also Palestinians in exile. Again, I'm not separating, but Palestinians in exile are subject to the similar type of harassment in the borders, the monitoring that takes place, the surveillance, the continued demonization that occurs. And I think today we just had our dear colleague Rabab Abdelhadi and what she's facing in San Francisco State University, for no other reason that she wants to study Palestinians. She wants to document their experiences and have a class actually put their experience within the context of normative studies. She's been harassed, demonized, and they want to chase her out for no other reason. Says Palestinians deserve to be studied with their own scholars studying them. I know it's a radical statement, right? because often Palestinians have to be studied like a Martian, and you have to bring the Israelis to study the Palestinians. So that's most often the case that occurs. So again, Palestinians in their infringement on their freedom or dignity. Also, item 3, by arbitrary arrest and illegal imprisonment of members of the racial group or groups. Palestinians are subject to constant arrest. We have about 6,000 plus Palestinian political prisoners inside Israeli jail. You have what's called administrative detention. This is an oxymoron. It's imprisonment without any trial. Not to say that the Israeli trials in the West Bank are anything other than a kangaroo courts, because it's run by military judges. The military judges themselves are most often settlers themselves. So the settler who stole your land and you're protesting against the settler who stole your land, you go to a court set up by the state apparatus that is occupying your land and bringing the settler in, and the judges that are sitting in there to administer not justice, are basically passing the judgment. So often, whether those who have went through a court system, which is a kangaroo court, right, and then you have the administrative, which you actually don't go to court, and these are administrative, basically restrict your life and continuously being extended. What is insulting is many of these foreign diplomats that come on what you call a frequent miles trip to Palestine, and they come to try to help the situation. They always ask the Palestinian about if there's an Israeli soldier or somebody that Palestinian resistance hold. You'll have one after the other trying to put and plea about this person and this person. You have letters taking place. They just what you call preoccupy you, but none, zero, zilch, not even the Arab who come to try right now normally. None of them actually mention a name of Palestinian prisoner. None of them call on the Palestinians to be released. None of them actually ask about the conditions of the prisoners, right? This is just adding insult to injury, which again, the Convention on Apartheid actually speaks about arbitrary arrest, right? So actually yesterday before, there was an arrest of Palestinians because they were playing with each other. There was a snowstorm in Palestine, which actually does take place. If you think the Oriental imagery that the Zionists have often, that this is a desert, they made the desert bloom. Palestine was never a desert. There's a desert in the south, it's called the Naqab, but Palestine was always the land of milk and honey, right? We did not need the Zionists to come and make the desert bloom. When actually the early Zionist settlers came, they didn't know how to cultivate the land. Again, if you trace it back to 1876, 1880, 1890, again, people don't read these days, or these days the Zionists believe their own what you call propaganda, which is actually the worst. You could put the propaganda, but once you believe your own propaganda, then you're just like you're in a different cloud altogether. Palestine was the land of milk and honey. Palestine has been cultivated throughout history, right? So again, and there's so many evidence. Palestinians actually sent, not to boast, again, sent food aid to the Irish during the Irish famine. We have actually ships that were loaded with supplies in the port cities in the Mediterranean by Palestinians that sent it out to the Irish who are facing the Irish famine. So again, the relationship with the Irish also goes a long way back in this sense. So again, to understand about the arrest, how all the people that come there actually don't ask in a way about the Palestinians, and we could compare it again. Not that comparisons are not needed. How many of us actually on a daily basis remember how many of our Black brothers and sisters are in America's prisons? America is the #1 country in the world in terms of prison population, and large segment of the prison population is either Black or Latinos, and many of them are going through the system based on racial discrimination. That's just the reality in there. And we have so many cases of trumped up charges, so many cases of false imprisonment, many cases of planted evidence on the black subject that get arrested. And remember that 92% of the cases are actually plea bargains. So many of our black brothers and sisters don't have the resources for a full legal team. So you have what public defenders. In essence, they come to a black person that was arrested with one crime or the other, and they say, well, if you go to court, you might face 10 or 15 or 20. Let's do a plea bargain. You admit to what you call guilt, and you'll take 5 years, and so on. So this ends up railroading large number of black subjects into the prison system, not dissimilar, again, to this racial arbitrary arrest that the Palestinians go through, and all under the rubric of security and safety. Deliberate imposition on a racial group or groups of living conditions calculated to cause its or their physical destruction in whole or in part. This is underway in the West Bank. Again, the deliberate imposition of living conditions. No running water in some places. You can't actually dig a water well in your own property in the West Bank. Can you imagine this? Just for us here in California, right? There are many farmers that during the difficult drought, they actually dug water wells in order to irrigate their field. In Palestine, you can't dig a well under your in your own land. However, a settler across the street from you who stole your own land or some other Palestinian land can not only dig a well, but actually the Israeli government facilitate linking him into the water system. So Israel actually, one of the elements is that Israel steals Palestinian waters and then sell it to us at a very inflated price. So can you just think about it? Israel steals Palestinian water from the West Bank aquifers, and then Palestinians buy this water because that's the only way for them to have water. That's really imposing living conditions on the Palestinians. I remembered. Now we're talking about 5G in terms of telephone network. Israel controls our telecommunication network on our airspace. Palestinians have not yet went into it's between 2G and 3G. And all that is managed by Israel. Israel is seen as the startup country, but their startup in apartheid is really fast more than anything. They're a startup country in one side, but they're a startup of apartheid. They have really made apartheid into such a systematic, improved process where everything related to the Palestinians as a racial group to be managed and totally controlled the domination. So Palestinians really don't have they don't have the 5G network, 4G network, or 5G network, not because they don't have the capacity themselves or that they don't have the skills. Actually, Palestinians, in terms of their skill, technology, and otherwise, are very, very advanced, and we could see their impact across the region as well as whenever you look at Palestinians. But Israel makes sure to completely degrade the structural element of communication with the Palestinians. Why? Again, it's security. Again, that's usually the term. So the deliberate imposition of living conditions on Palestinians. Last aspect is the whole legislations and the policies that are put in there. Any measures, including legislative measures designed to divide the population along racial lines by the creation of separate reserves or separate areas of the members. Israel has fragmented and divided up Palestinians. Every racist system works on creating classification for different bodies of people, and access to rights and access to privileges and so on are accorded in relations to the crafting of this racial classification. Israel has perfected this racial classification both in 48 but also in the 1967 area in there. And as such, this classification is occurring in terms of as a legal structure, but also privileging the Jewish members of the society, Jewish Zionist members of society, versus the Palestinians. And as such, crafting this legislation that demarcates rights and privileges, rights to labor, rights to loans, right? All these rights are crafted accordingly. So again, this is very important. This Article 2 of the Apartheid Convention, and I would also add for people to read some, but also I would say the Convention on Genocide is applicable to the Palestinians, because Palestinians have been subject. You don't have to eliminate the whole population for you to actually have the effective articles of the Convention of Genocide to be considered. So these are the Convention on the Apartheid Convention, and the Convention on Genocide is to be considered. So for those who were with me today, thank you for being with me. I know that I was planning on a shorter discussion, but the discussion went in whichever way that it went, and that's fine. But again, let me repeat for you, please download the report if you want to take action. Download the report. If you are unable to mail it directly, then write an email and attach this report with your email to your Congress representative, to your mayor, your city council, the president of or chancellor of university. If you're at the university department, make it known that we're dealing with an apartheid system, and this apartheid is impacting the Palestinians. It's very, very important. And maybe also you could organize events and discussions, whether in groups or in public gatherings, in order to make this information known. If a tree falls in the forest, nobody sees it, nobody takes a picture of it, and it's not on Instagram or social media, did it really fall? So today we have a report, which is a tree that has fallen, a tree that is describing the branches of apartheid, the structures of apartheid, the trunk of apartheid relative to Israel imposition of racial discrimination on Palestinians. It is you that you need to actually make possible for it to be documented, to be spread out, and to actually be undertaken across, and to make sure to involve yourself in that. I do also call on people to support the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, sanction. This is your local empowerment at the local level to have an impact on Palestine. So thank you. And if you want this will be loaded into my YouTube, so you could share it with others. It's if you actually enjoyed what we have discussed, and hopefully we'll have some additional ones in the future. So thank you. Good evening. It's nighttime here in Berkeley, but take care, and wish you and all your family the best. Assalamu alaikum.